The Government is introducing legislation to transform our environment through the Environment Bill, including measures to improve how we manage our resources and waste, and we continue to work with other countries to move towards a resource-efficient and circular economy.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I'm grateful for the VP's answer. I've had many conversations with schools around my patch of passionate young people from St Margaret's School, from St Martin's School, from South Charnwood School, who are dedicated to recycling. And they wanted me to ask, will the government consider asking for international targets on recycling rates to drive up recycling across the globe?
Like my honourable friend, the school children in my own constituency are passionate and regularly communicating with me about reducing waste and reusing materials. The government's view is that taking action is the best way to drive progress, and harnessing that consumer power to drive changes for packaging use, I think, in the goods that we all buy. And I think our children are the ones who are going to help all of us as parents across the country to help drive that. But domestically, we're introducing the Extended Producer Responsibility Scheme to ensure that producers cover the full net cost of recovery for packaging waste, and a deposit return scheme to increase the recycling of drinks containers. That will help us to achieve a 65% recycling rate by 2035.
12, Mr. Speaker.
Through the COP26 Nature Campaign, we are driving action to protect and restore forests and critical ecosystems, as well as helping to catalyse a sustainable transition of the agriculture sector and food systems through our forest, agriculture and commodity trade dialogues.
Chris Green. Speaker, I'm grateful to my right honourable friend for what he's doing. Can I ask him to step up the work he's doing on ensuring that protecting ecosystems is a part of the agreement we hope will be reached at COP? I know we have the summit in China, but the protection of habitats and ecosystems around the world is so much an important part of dealing with climate change that I hope it'll be part of the deal in the autumn. But can I also ask him to put some pressure on the Brazilian government over the measures that appear to be happening there that could accelerate rather than reduce the loss of the Amazon rainforest?
Mr. Speaker, my honourable friend raises a very important point. He will know that the UK co-led the development of the Leaders' Pledge for Nature, which almost 90 leaders from around the world have endorsed, committing to global action to protect nature. And of course, we are campaigning for strong biodiversity targets to be set at the Biodiversity COP in Kunming this October. And as you would expect, I am in contact with the Brazilian government as well.
Right. We now have a substantive question to Minister Tremel.
We're exploring opportunities for strengthened international collaboration on innovation focused on the bioeconomy through Mission Innovation, a global initiative to enable affordable clean energy and achieve the goals of the Paris Agreement. Leveraging growth of the bioeconomy will support clean growth across multiple sectors and contribute towards achieving net zero greenhouse gas emissions by 2050.
Let's go to Rachel Maskell. Rachel.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The climate crisis is turbocharged as the trajectory of mitigation ever deviates from planet-saving targets, while the government moves at a glacial pace to establish a climate economy. Yorkshire will not only create 4,000 new jobs and upskill 25,000 people, it will lay the foundations for world-beating research in biosciences here in York and Yorkshire, offsetting carbon and waste. All we ask is for government to bring forward the funding already committed ahead of COP26. Will she agree to do this and meet with me to discuss the project and the importance of Yorkshire?
I'm always happy to meet with all new and really interesting, innovative projects. I'm very happy to commit to do that and we can discuss them. I think we are absolutely leading the way in this, and Mission Innovation is an extraordinary organisation driving some of the most forward-thinking processes and shining a light on them, because one of the key challenges to helping the developing countries to be able to move to clean growth is that the technologies that UK businesses and our scientists invent and take to market can actually be used in those developing countries.
Substantive question to President Sharma.
Mr. Speaker, the UK is committed to championing diversity and inclusion throughout our COP26 presidency. More than 45% of the senior management team in the COP26 unit are women, including our Chief Operating Officer and Communications Director, and around half of the COP26 negotiating team are women.
Let's go to Brenda Sharma. Brenda.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Later this year, I'm hosting the British South Asian Youth Summit. focusing on COP26. Will the minister meet with our youth champions to hear the perspective of young people living in some of the areas of the world most vulnerable to climate change?
Mr. Speaker, as I said in response to an earlier question, of course we have the Civil Society Youth Advisory Group. There are co-chairs, chairs, young climate activists, one from the Global South and one from the Global North. And on every visit that I do, I meet youth activists. Of course, I'm very happy to look at the event that he's talking about, and if my diary permits, I will certainly come to it.
Peter Buck.
15, sir.
Mr. Speaker, our overarching objective is to keep within reach the target of limiting global temperature rise to 1.5 degrees. To do this, we're asking countries to set out ambitious emissions reduction commitments, come forward with plans to protect communities and nature, mobilise finance and reach agreement on the outstanding elements of the Paris Rulebook.
Peter Buck.
Mr. Speaker, you will remember when David Cameron was hugging huskies, and I thought it was a great idea to try and do something to save the planet. So I got rid of my polluting petrol car, bought a biofuel car, and then discovered I was destroying the rainforest. So I knew what to do next: get CO2 down, buy a diesel car. Now I know that when I drive along the street, I'm poisoning people. So could the President please give me some advice? Before buying an electric car, will he assure me that the mining of cobalt and lithium isn't killing people in the mines? Or would it just be easier for me to buy a horse?
Well, it will certainly be sustainable, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I'm really pleased to hear that my honourable friend is indeed a climate activist at heart. It's a revelation for all of us. It's great that he's made a decision to purchase an electric vehicle. I can tell him he won't be disappointed. Plug-in grants are available, and he knows the government is also backing the sector with almost £3 billion worth of support.
Shadow Minister Matthew Penn.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. As the President knows, the International Energy Association's latest World Energy Outlook makes clear that a net zero pathway for global energy requires that there be no new fossil fuel supply beyond projects already committed as of this year. That means not just coal, but also oil and gas. The report reinforces, Mr. Speaker, the obvious need to secure agreement on a global framework for a managed and fair phase-out of fossil fuels. Could the President tell the House, therefore, whether he accepts the IEA's conclusion, and if so, whether ending all new fossil fuel supply from next year will be incorporated into the objectives of the UK's presidency of COP26?
Well, Mr. Speaker, I actually commissioned that report, and I'm very pleased that it is so substantive. Of course, he's right. What we need to make sure is to help all countries with a clean energy transition, and that is what we are doing through the work of the COP26 Energy Transition Council.
Robert Halfon.
One, sir.
Mr. Speaker, 2 weeks ago I co-chaired the G7 Climate and Environment Ministers track with my right honourable friend, the Deferent Secretary of State. At this meeting, the G7 nations agreed to overwhelmingly decarbonise their power systems in the 2030s, consistent with their 2030 NDCs and net zero commitments, and in addition, they committed to take concrete steps to end support for international coal power generation by the end of 2021. This is a critical step in consigning coal power to history and accelerating the international transition to clean energy.
Robert Half.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Of course, we welcome plans for a cleaner, greener Britain, but can my right honourable friend give reassurances to my hard-working Harlow residents that the government's environmental measures will not mean a more expensive Britain hitting the low paid with extra costs and increasing the cost of living for ordinary folk?
Mr. Speaker, the government is indeed committed to getting the transition to net zero right for all consumers. We're committed to driving savings and making our homes better insulated with more energy efficient measures. And indeed, he will know that through the energy company obligation and the expanded warm homes discount, we will provide at least £4.7 billion of extra support to low income and vulnerable households between 2022 and 2026.
Shadow President Edmondson.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, for a successful COP26, we have a particular responsibility as hosts to build trust with developing countries. The government's decision to cut aid spending, the only G7 country to do so, is therefore an appalling one, not just because it's wrong in principle, but because it's staggeringly self-defeating. Now, he knows the decision makes a successful outcome at the COP harder, not easier. So can I invite him to add his voice to the powerful calls we heard yesterday, including from the former Prime Minister, the Right Honourable Member for Maidenhead, to immediately restore government aid spending to 0.7% of GDP?
Mr. Speaker, as the Honourable Gentleman knows, the UK is doubling its international climate finance commitment to support developing countries, and I can tell him this has been very much welcomed around the world. With regards to the overall ODA spend, as he knows, this is a temporary measure, and as the economic situation improves, I hope it will be possible to restore the 0.7 target at the earliest opportunity.
Mr. Speaker, the problem is that cutting aid spending severely undermines the ability of developing countries to tackle the challenges of climate, poverty and public health, and he knows that, and that's what developing countries are telling him in the negotiations. We need vulnerable countries to be calling for more ambition from big emitters like China, but they're going to be much more reticent to do so when they don't feel we can be trusted. Now, totemic on the issue of trust is the promise made at Copenhagen for $100 billion of public and private finance for developing countries. More than a decade on, it still hasn't been delivered. It's our job as hosts to deliver on this promise. So can he therefore tell us, will the $100 billion finally be delivered this weekend at the G7 meeting?
Mr. Speaker, he's absolutely right. The $100 billion is a totemic figure, and we are doing everything we can to ensure that we are able to deliver that by COP26. And I can assure him that I am having very frank discussions with donor countries, with developed countries, to ensure that they deliver on this commitment that was made in 2009.
Dr. Andrew Morrison.
Does the COP presidency share my concern at the reputational hit that the UK will take in the event that it continues to approve old-style carbon-belching waste incinerators like the one proposed at Westbury in my constituency?
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. All energy from waste plants in England are regulated by the Environment Agency and must comply with the strict emissions limits set down in legislation. I'm aware that Northacre Renewable Energy Limited has applied for an environmental permit from the Environment Agency to operate an incinerator in Westbury, Wiltshire, and the Environment Agency is considering responses to the public consultation.
Let's go to Joanna Charing. Joanna.
Mr. Speaker, 11% of Scottish renewable generation comes from small projects like Harlaw Hydro in my constituency. So ahead of COP26, will the government introduce a replacement for the feed-in tariff, which is better placed to encourage similar new projects than the Smart Export Guarantee Scheme?
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. We will be launching a new contract for difference auction in at the end of this year, and the opportunity for a number of smaller sources of energy storage will be available.
Michael Longit.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Will the Minister detail what steps he has taken to engage with the G7 ahead of COP26?
Mr. Speaker, can I commend my honourable friend for all the work he's doing in Dudley in terms of supporting the local economy and green jobs. And as I set out earlier, I co-chaired the G7 Climate Environment Ministers meeting, which came forward with some ambitious commitments.
The world's not currently on track to meet our Paris targets, are we? The current pledges only add up to less than 10% emissions, and we need 45% to meet the target. In the last parliamentary session, 109 MPs signed the Climate and Ecological Emergency Bill. When it is reintroduced, will the government give time to debate this bill, just so, as we did with the Climate Change Act 2008, we can lead the world on legislation, not just follow?
President Sean.
Well, Mr. Speaker, I would recommend that he talks to the Leader of the House on the matters of the timetabling for debates and other events in this House. What I would say to him is that we are working very hard and pressing all the big emitters to ensure they come forward with the ambition that is required to be able to halve emissions by 2030.
Mr. Speaker, I'm currently doing a lot of work in my constituency with people on the climate agenda in preparation for the COP summit. And local school children and young people are particularly interested and have asked me, one child in particular has asked me to raise this question with the President. To beat climate change, we've got to look at it as a whole world. Surely this means giving more, not less, help to poorer countries to help them make the changes needed to save our planet.
President Starmer.
Well, Mr. Speaker, the honourable gentleman raised the issue with me. I've set out the position when it comes to overseas aid. In terms of schools, we are engaging, and I hope I will shortly be able to send out a pack which will encourage young people around our schools to get even more involved in COP26.
Right, we now go to questions to the Prime Minister. And I start with Gavin Newlands. Gavin.
Number one, Mr. Speaker.
Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, I'm delighted that the UK is hosting the leaders of the world's greatest democracies at the G7 summit in Cornwall this week. This is the first meeting between G7 leaders since the start of the pandemic. Mr. Speaker, this week is Carers Week, and I'm sure the whole House will wish to join me in thanking care workers and everyone caring for family, friends and loved ones. Their selflessness and devotion to helping others is an inspiration to us all. Mr. Speaker, this morning I had meetings with ministerial colleagues and others. In addition to my duties in this House, I shall have further such meetings later today.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. And I very much echo the comments of the Prime Minister on the work of unpaid carers. But after plenty of warm words for the victims of fire and rehire, including from the Prime Minister himself, the Government yesterday announced its legislative response to the ACAS report of doing absolutely nothing. Nothing for the hundreds of thousands already threatened, or as the ACAS report itself says, the many, many more that are anticipated to face fire and rehire when the furlough scheme ends. He should be thoroughly ashamed of himself, Mr. Speaker. It's increasingly clear this Government won't protect workers, so will it devolve employment law to Holyrood so the Scottish Government can?
Actually, Mr. Speaker, the Government has been absolutely clear that it's unacceptable to use threats of firing and rehiring as a negotiating tactic. We welcome the ACAS report, which actually finds that hire and fire should only be used in limited circumstances, such as to prevent job losses, Mr. Speaker, when other options have been exhausted. We therefore asked ACAS to produce clearer guidance to help employers with other options.
Bradley.
Prime Minister, we're on a mission in the East Midlands to create 84,000 jobs for local people. We're legislating for planning powers for our development corporation, which will work in tandem with our unique inland freeport. But, Mr. Speaker, decisions about HS2 and specifically the Toton Hub will have a huge impact on whether we can deliver on our vision for the East Midlands. Would the Prime Minister meet with me urgently so we can make sure we can deliver on that commitment to local people?
Mr. Speaker, the East Midlands could have no more fervent or effective champion, and I congratulate my honourable friend on his vision for the East Midlands Freeport and all the benefits that rail integration will bring, and I know that he's about to have a meeting with ministerial colleagues to determine how the integrated rail plan can work with HS2 best to achieve his objectives.
Let's go to the Leader of the Opposition, Keir Starmer.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. This is the first PMQ since the Prime Minister and Carrie got married. So can I offer my warm congratulations to the Prime Minister and his wife and wish them a happy life together. I have to say I admire the way they managed to keep it secret. Can I join with the Prime Minister on his comments about Carers Week? And can I also send our deepest sympathies to the 4 people killed in Sunday's terror attack in Canada? It was, as the Canadian Prime Minister said, an attack motivated by hatred and Islamophobia, and we must all unite against that at home and abroad. And can I ask the Prime Minister to pass on our thoughts and condolences to the Canadian Prime Minister when he sees him later this week? Mr. Speaker, why does the Prime Minister think that his now former education advisor, Kevin Collins, described the government's education plan as half-hearted, that risked failing thousands of children, hundreds of thousands of children, and not being even close to meeting the scale of what is needed?
Mr. Speaker, first of all, I want to thank Kevin Collins for his work, and but above all, I want to thank actually pupils, parents, teachers for everything they've done throughout this pandemic. And the struggle has been enormous, and actually what the government is doing is, in addition to the £14 billion, the extra £14 billion we committed, taking per pupil funding in primary schools up to £4,000 per head, in secondary schools up to £5,150, Mr. Speaker. We're now putting another £3 billion into educational catch-up with the biggest tutoring programme anywhere in the world, Mr. Speaker, and it is based on the best evidence that we could find and that Sir Kevin could supply.
Keir Starmer.
Mr. Speaker, Let me get this right. In February, the Prime Minister appoints an expert to come up with a catch-up plan for education. He's a highly respected expert, consults widely and comes up with a plan. The Treasury balks at it and says we'll only provide 10%, yes, 1/10 of what's needed. The Prime Minister rolls over whatever he says and children lose out. So much for levelling up. Let me help the Prime Minister with the numbers. The funding he announced last week is about £50 per child per year. And even if you add in previous announcements, in England it's only £310 per child over 4 years. Yet in the US there's a catch-up plan worth £1,600 per child. And in the Netherlands it's £2,500. So can the Prime Minister explain, when he was told by his expert that he appointed that only an ambitious, fully funded catch-up plan would do, only an ambitious, fully funded catch-up plan, why did he come up with something which, in the words of that same expert, is too small, too narrow and too slow?
Mr. Speaker, I think that the Right Honourable Gentleman needs to do the maths, because actually, and he needs to do some catch-up on his own mathematics, because in addition to the 14 billion I've already referred to, Mr. Speaker, there was already another £1.5 billion of catch-up. This is a £3 billion catch-up plan just for starters, Mr. Speaker, and it includes the biggest programme of tuition of 1-to-1, 1-to-2, 1-to-3 tutorials anywhere in the world. And we all know, Mr. Speaker, that there are schools in this country, classrooms in this country, where children are getting private tutorials, private tuition, thanks to the hard work of their parents. He asks about levelling up. What we want to do is get on the side of all the kids who don't have access to that tutorial, Mr. Speaker, to support them. That's what I mean by levelling up, Mr. Speaker.
Who does the Prime Minister think he's kidding? He asked Kevin Collins to tell him what was necessary to catch up. Kevin Collins told him, and he said no. Who does he think he's kidding? The Chancellor's decision, and I assume it was the Chancellor's decision, it always is, to hold back the investment that's needed is a completely false economy. The long-term costs are likely to be at least £100 billion, probably more, and who will be hardest hit, Prime Minister? Kids from disadvantaged backgrounds. Mr. Speaker, if the government doesn't change course, this will hold Britain back for a generation. And here's the difference between us and them. Because when Labour says education is our #1 priority, we mean it. That's why we published a bold £15 billion plan to catch up on education for every child. We're putting that to a vote this afternoon. If the Prime Minister is really serious about this, he'd back that motion. Will he do so?
Mr. Speaker, I'll tell you the difference between us and the party opposite is that we put in the tough measures that are needed to give kids a better education across the country. When we rolled out the Academies programme, Mr. Speaker, which have driven up standards across the country, who opposed it? They did. When we put in tough measures to ensure discipline in schools, Mr. Speaker, they opposed it. At the last election, Mr. Speaker, they even campaigned to get rid of Ofsted, which is so vital. But they did. He stood on a manifesto to get rid of Ofsted. Will he now say that he not only supports our tuition programme, but he supports our radical programme to support teachers with better training? £400 million we're now putting in, not only a starting salary for teachers of £30,000, which we've introduced, but another £400 million to support better training for teachers. That's what we're backing in our party. They are serious, costed reforms and are based on evidence, unlike anything he's producing.
Just a moment, and we'll have a little less shouting from the side. Just to remind the Prime Minister, it's Prime Minister's questions. It isn't about the agenda of last general election. Keir Starmer. The Prime Minister, Ofsted, was not the question. I'm not interested in what they put on the agenda. I'm more interested in you answering the question. Keir Starmer.
Mr. Speaker, let me take this very slowly for the Prime Minister. The Collins review commissioned by the government was very clear. If the Collins proposed action is not taken, the attainment gap will rise between 10 and 24%. That was on a slide shown to the Prime Minister last week. And he talks about the various measures, so let's look at this more closely. Which part of our plan does he oppose? The plan that's being voted on this afternoon. Is it breakfast clubs for every child, Does he oppose that? Is it quality mental health support in every school? Does he oppose that? Is it more tutoring for every child that needs it? Does he oppose that? Or additional investment for children who've suffered the most? Which part of our plan does the Prime Minister object to? And if he doesn't object to it and he agrees with it, why doesn't he vote for it?
Mr. Speaker, I think with great respect, Mr. Speaker, I do think I'm entitled to draw attention to what the Labour Party stood on at the last election. And that was, and they haven't yet repudiated it, they did want to get rid of Ofsted, Mr. Speaker. But I will tell the right honourable gentleman that if he is now saying that he supports our tutoring programme, and that's what I think I understood from him just now, then that is a good thing, because hitherto what has happened is that the kids of well-off parents, thanks to their hard work, have been able to rely on private tutoring. What the government is now doing is coming in on the side of all the other kids who don't get access to that. 6 million kids, 6 million children, Mr. Speaker, 6 million children will have access to tuition thanks to this programme. It is a fantastic thing. It is a revolution in education for this country. If he's now saying that he supports it, Mr. Speaker, then that's a good thing, though I've learnt in the course of the last year that his support can sometimes be evanescent, Mr. Speaker.
Mr. Speaker, he pretends he's here for the other kids. The report says the attainment gap will go up between 10 to 24% if the action isn't taken. He's just rejected it. How can he be on the side of the other kids? Come off it. We've been here before. Free school meals, U-turn, exams fiasco, U-turn, now catch-up. The Prime Minister's been all over the place when it comes to education. And he's on the wrong side of it again. Mr. Speaker, I now want to turn to this week's G7. This will be the first major summit of since the recovery. The UK needs to lead, not just to host. The priority must, of course, be a clear plan to vaccinate the world. As the Delta variant shows, nobody is safe from this virus until everybody is safe. The Prime Minister has made big promises on this, but it needs a truly global effort to make it happen. So will the Prime Minister take the lead at the G7 and do whatever is necessary to make global vaccinations a reality?
Yes, indeed, Mr. Speaker. And actually, I think what the people of this country also understand is that not only were we able to give one of the first authorisations for the AstraZeneca, the Oxford AstraZeneca vaccine, but also, thanks to the deal the government did between the Oxford scientists and AstraZeneca, we were able to ensure that 1 in 3 of the 1.5 billion doses that have been distributed around the world are the Oxford AstraZeneca vaccine. That is global Britain in action, to say nothing of the billion vaccines that we hope to raise from the G7 this week.
Keir Starmer.
Mr. Speaker, that would sound a lot better if the Prime Minister wasn't the only G7 leader cutting his aid budget. I hear what the Prime Minister says about vaccines, but we also need clear global agreement and global funding. Hundreds of former leaders, businesses and development groups have called for exactly that kind of leadership at the G7. And that's what we need to see from the Prime Minister this weekend. Mr. Speaker, the G7, bilateral discussions with President Biden and the possibility of a new government in Israel also provide a real chance to restart a meaningful Middle East peace process. The appalling violence recently, which killed 63 children in Gaza and 2 children in Israel, shows just how urgent this is. For too many people in Palestine, the promise of an end to the occupation and a recognised sovereign Palestinian state feels more distant than ever. So will the Prime Minister take the opportunity this weekend to press for renewed international agreement, to finally recognise the state of Palestine alongside a safe and secure Israel, to stop the expansion of illegal settlements and to get a meaningful peace process back up and running?
Mr. Speaker, it's been a long-standing objective of this government, and I think it's common ground across this House that the solution for the Middle East peace process is a two-state solution. We continue to press for that, and I've made that position plain in my conversations both with the Palestinian Authority and, of course, with Israel. Mr. Speaker, he attacks the government, I think, for failing to be sufficiently ambitious in our overseas aid spending. I think I heard him say that in that compendious question. Let me just tell him, well, he's gesturing at these benches, Mr. Speaker. Under this government, we've spent more, and we continue to spend more than Labour ever did. Labour ever did. Under Blair, under Brown, even when they were spending money on Brazilian dancers in Hackney to raise consciousness, which is what they did, to raise consciousness of global poverty, Mr. Speaker. We are spending £10 billion a year at a time of acute financial difficulty for this country, and I think the British people know that is the right priority for this country. And I think, if Labour members want to vote on that matter, Mr. Speaker, and may I just remind them that the people of this country had an opportunity to vote on the way the government is handling it last month and the balance that we were striking, and I think that they adjudicated firmly in the favour of the government, Mr. Speaker. They pontificate and prevaricate and procrastinate.
Felicity Kendall, come on! I can even.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. You've made me slightly older, yes. I am very proud of my government's record on the environment and the fact that we have cut emissions at the fastest rate of any G7 country. I welcome the fact that Lancaster West Estate in my constituency has benefited from a green grant of almost £20 million to decarbonise. Does my right honourable friend agree with me that we need to build back better in a green way and in a way that levels up all parts of the United Kingdom?
Yes, I do, and I thank you, Mr. Speaker. My honourable friend's absolutely right. That's why we committed a total of £3.8 billion to fund energy improvement in the performance, particularly of social rented homes.
Leader of the SNP, Ian Blackford.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm sure we're all looking forward to the European Championships kicking off later this week. Can I take the opportunity to wish all the best to our country, Scotland, to Steve Clark and the team, and to remind the team it is time for heroes. Mr. Speaker, later this week the Prime Minister will walk into the G7 summit as the only leader, Prime Minister, cutting development aid to the world's poorest. At the very moment when global leadership is needed more than ever, this Tory government is walking away from millions still struggling from the COVID pandemic and a poverty pandemic. The Prime Minister has been hiding on this issue for months. This is a government on the run from their own moral and legal responsibilities, and on the run, Mr. Speaker, from their own backbenchers. But the Prime Minister can't hide from this issue any longer, and he can't run from democracy in this House. Will he stand up today and commit to a straight vote in this House on his inhumane cuts as demanded by the Speaker? Prime Minister, it is a very simple question. Yes or no?
And by the way, Mr. Speaker, wish all the very best to Scotland and England and all the home nations who may be playing in this. I don't know whether he's going to reciprocate, Mr. Speaker, but you never know. It's worth a shot. I thought. Oh, you did? Okay, there you go. That's nice of him. Anyway, Mr. Speaker, I think the answer is clear. The people of this country, as I said to the right honourable gentleman, were given a vote on this and many other matters very recently, and I think they adjudicated very firmly in favour of the balance the government is striking. We are in very, very difficult financial times, but you shouldn't believe the lefty propaganda, Mr. Speaker, that you hear from people opposite. We're spending £10 billion overseas. We've actually increased. All they want to do is run this country down, Mr. Speaker. Run this country down. When we've increased spending on girls' education alone to £500 million, almost £500 million. That is a fantastic sum of money to be spending in difficult times, Mr. Speaker. And we should be proud.
Ian Blackford.
Mr. Speaker, I have to say I don't think I've ever heard the previous Prime Minister, the right honourable member from Maidenhead, called a leftist propagandist. The simple fact of the matter, Prime Minister, is every single party Every single member of this House stood on a manifesto commitment of 0.7%. The Prime Minister has reneged on that, and the Speaker has indicated that the government should allow a vote on it. It's pretty basic stuff. After a year dealing with the deadly virus, why can't the Prime Minister get this? In a pandemic, no one is safe until everyone is safe. Now is the time to support each other, not to walk away from those in need. People are dying and they need our help. The Prime Minister has the nerve to brag about the government support for the vulnerable, and at the very same time he is slashing $4.5 billion from the world's poorest. In the week of the G7, what kind of world leader washes their hands of responsibility by cutting water and hygiene projects by more than 80% in the middle of a pandemic?
Mr. Speaker, I may say that I think that the last contribution was absolutely disgraceful, because the people of this country have gone through a very difficult time. We've had to spend £407 billion supporting jobs, families, livelihoods throughout the country, and yet we are continuing to support international vaccination. £1.6 billion this country has contributed to Gavi. I think £548 million to COVAX. And let me just remind him of the statistic I mentioned earlier. 1 in 3 of the vaccines being distributed around the world to the poorest and the neediest come from the Oxford AstraZeneca supply. Thanks to the deal this government did. Or does the name Oxford AstraZeneca continue to stick in his craw, Mr. Speaker?
Scott Benton.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. May I welcome plans outlined by the Education Secretary last week, which will oversee a tutoring revolution in this country, a proven way to help the most disadvantaged children to catch up. Is the Prime Minister able to confirm that this is just one part of our wider plan to ensure that no child misses out as a consequence of a disruption caused by this pandemic?
Yes, Mr. Speaker. I thank my honourable friend, because the whole point of the tutoring programme is that it is evidence-based, and every tutoring programme, and I say there are 6 million pupils, children who can benefit, is equivalent to 3 to 5 months of educational catch-up. We're also, Mr. Speaker, going to be looking at increasing time in schools. And I hope that the loyal opposition, Mr. Speaker, may use their influence with their paymasters in the teaching unions to encourage them in that objection.
Colin Maceman.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Prime Minister knows full well that the best way to reduce checks in the Irish Sea is to do a Swiss-style SBS agreement with the European Union. So far, he's decided not to do that. So why is he prioritising cheap, dodgy beef from Australia over the concerns of the people of Northern Ireland and reducing checks in the Irish Sea?
No, Mr. Speaker. What we're prioritising is the right and ability of the people of Northern Ireland to have access, as they should, freely and uninterruptedly to goods and services from the whole of the UK, and we are working to ensure that we protect the territorial and economic integrity of our country. That's what matters.
Kevin Holland.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Prime Minister's excellent First Homes policy will allow tens of thousands of key workers and local first-time buyers to buy a home every year at a discount of up to 50% from the market price. Would he consider turbocharging this policy by establishing a National Land Commission to assemble public sector land to facilitate the development of potentially hundreds of thousands of more half-price homes, so more people can see the benefits of home ownership?
I thank my honourable friend. Last year we delivered the highest, in spite of the difficulties we face, the highest number of new homes for over 30 years, but his point is an extremely good one, as all honourable members know. We must find better, faster ways of releasing publicly owned land, brownfield sites for development, and that is exactly why we're looking at the suggestion he makes.
Barisha.
Mr. Speaker, the Prime Minister, in his very first speech, mentioned levelling up. My constituents want to know when it's going to start. The fact of the matter, and I understand that he's lived a life of privilege and doesn't know much about the pumped state sector, He knows a lot about the private sector in education. What are the markers for success? He's head of his own Industrial Strategy Council, says he's levelling up with these resources, with this management team, will not work and will not be successful. My local Kirklees Council says it's so complex, nothing is flowing down to the grassroots. When will we see the first signs of genuine levelling up in our country?
Mr. Speaker, I think that what you're seeing across the country is people responding to massive investment, £640 billion programme of investment in roads, in schools, in hospitals, in policing, bit by bit is transforming people's lives, hopes and opportunities. And that is fundamentally the difference between his side of the argument and ours. We believe that there is talent, genius, flair around the whole country, but opportunity is not evenly distributed. And that is our ambition, and that is what we are doing with our campaign to levelling up. If he's now saying, by the way, that he supports what we're doing on the tutoring revolution, because I know he's a great educational expert, then I'm glad to hear it.
Brendan Clark.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My constituents in Bassetlaw have been the victims of illegal encampments, most recently at Far Park in Worksop, where local taxpayers have been left with a clean-up bill running into thousands of pounds, and residents have been left feeling powerless following a sustained period of antisocial behaviour in the locality. Can the Prime Minister tell us what steps we are taking now to ensure we stop this from happening in the future and allow residents and local authorities to take back control of trespassing?
Well, Mr. Speaker, the Police, Crime, Sentencing and Courts Bill, my honourable friend will be pleased to know, introduce a new criminal offence where a person who resides or intends to reside on land with a vehicle and without permission has caused or is likely to cause significant damage or distress can face new penalties, Mr. Speaker. And guess who voted against that bill on a three-line whip? Does anybody know? It was the right honourable gentleman and his entire party.
Maybe in Hamilton.
Mr. Speaker, a few years ago, one of my elderly constituents with late-stage dementia was married by a man who'd befriended her. Upon her death, the man subsequently inherited the whole of her estate because under the law as it stands, their marriage had revoked her previous will. Hundreds of people since then have contacted me citing similar experiences, but 3 registrars general have refused to meet me to discuss it. So will the Prime Minister now act to bring this cruel exploitation to an end?
Well, I thank the honourable gentleman for raising the concern that he has and the injustice that he mentioned. I'll make sure that he gets a meeting as soon as possible with the relevant Minister in the Justice Department.
David Jones.
Mr. Speaker, according to newspaper reports, the European Union are unhappy with the negotiating style of the Right Honourable Lord Frost. But does my right honourable friend agree that, in fact, Lord Frost is doing a superb job negotiating in the national interest? And does he further agree with Lord Frost's assessment that the Northern Ireland Protocol, as currently applied, is unsustainable and that matters would be considerably easier if the European Union were to adopt a more pragmatic approach rather than the purist approach they're adopting at the moment?
I thank my right honourable friend, and I agree with him completely, because I think that Lord Frost is doing an outstanding job, and I venture to say, Mr. Speaker, he is the greatest Frost since the Great Frost of 1709, whatever it was.
Andrew Gwynn.
Thank you. The Prime Minister has seen his advisor on ethics and standards resign over his failure to uphold the ministerial code. He's seen the head of the government's legal department resign over his failure to uphold international law. And he's seen his advisor on education catch-up resign over his failure to provide proper funding for children. Why does the Prime Minister think this keeps happening to him?
Mr. Speaker, I'm indebted to everybody who serves the government in whatever capacity. We have a lot of very tough decisions to make, but we will continue to get on with delivering the people's priorities. And by the way, we will continue to ensure that we deliver value for money, that we don't waste taxpayers' money, and that ministers follow the ministerial code.
Theresa May.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. In April 1989, 96 Liverpool fans were unlawfully killed at Hillsborough. Yet nobody has been successfully prosecuted for their part in those unlawful killings. The most recent trial collapsed because although it was accepted that police evidence had been altered, because it was evidence to a public inquiry, it did not constitute perversion in the course of justice. Will my right honourable friend urgently look at the ramifications of this judgment for current and future public inquiries, and ensure that in future people are given the justice that has been so cruelly denied to the families of the Hillsborough 96?
Mr. Speaker, I thank my right honourable friend for her question, and of course the families of the 96 who died in the Hillsborough disaster and those who were injured have shown tremendous courage and determination. Now, my right honourable friend raises a particular issue about the recent court case and asks for a review of the law, and I can give her the assurance that we will always consider opportunities to review the law and how it operates if necessary, and we will certainly be looking at the case she describes.
Let's go to Peter Grant. Peter.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. In just over 3 years, the directors of Blackmore Bond plc took £46 million of other people's money and made it disappear. Around 2,800 small investors who the directors promised that money would be secure now face losing everything. Most of the money, around £26 million, was only taken by Blackmore Bond after the Financial Conduct Authority had compelling evidence from an expert witness who told them he thought the company was breaking the law, but before the FCA took any decisive action. How many more scandals like this will it take before we have a regulatory environment that's fit for purpose and offers our constituents proper protection against investment scams?
I thank the honourable gentleman for raising the case he does, and I'm afraid, Mr. Speaker, I have no advance notice of it and can't comment on the case in question, except to say if he will send me details, we will get back to him as soon as we can.
David. I'm delighted that Southend-on-Sea has now been given the opportunity to become a city. But in the 50s, 60s and 70s, 1.5 million ladies were forced to give up their babies for adoption. By any standards, that was cruel, and the hurt is still felt by those ladies today. So will my right honourable friend agree with me that an apology should be given and an acknowledgement that forced adoptions was wrong by all those involved in the process?
Mr. Speaker, I echo my right honourable friend's sentiments about Southend, but also what he says about those who've been affected by forced adoption. The practices that led to forced adoption can't now occur because the law protects both parents. He asked for an apology, Mr. Speaker, and I can tell him that the agencies involved in forced adoption in the past have apologised for their role, Mr. Speaker, and quite right too.
Let's go to Ian Lavery. Ian.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. As eloquently highlighted by my right honourable friend, the Leader of the Opposition, recent reports have revealed that during the pandemic, the loss in learning has been absolutely catastrophic. The North East is once again sadly trailing the field, and in some subjects more than double the loss of other regions. The attainment gap, which has been mentioned, between the most and least affluent areas is set to grow potentially at 10 to 24%. That's desperate, you know, really desperate. The government's catch-up funding is quite simply derisory, too small, too narrow, too slow, or comments being articulated by the former Education Recovery Chief before his unfortunate resignation. Prime Minister, the parents in Wansbeck, in my constituency, are listening. You've got a wonderfully privileged educational background. Can you use it to explain how 20 pence per day helps kids in my patch catch up?
Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, I can tell the honourable gentleman that he's again, I'm afraid what he's saying is completely wrong. The sums are huge that we're already investing in education, and we've announced the £3 billion additional package of catch-up, including the biggest, not just investing in teacher training, another 400 million to help teachers improve their qualifications as they go up the ladder, but also the biggest tuition programme in the history of this country, the biggest anywhere in the world. And that will make a huge difference to young people in Wansbeck and across the country. Many kids are getting private tuition at the moment, Mr. Speaker. Loads aren't. We want to level up.
Mr. Speaker, recently I met with Gianni Singh, who founded the Sikh Helpline 25 years ago and is based on West Bromwich High Street. We met to hear about the fantastic work they've done over the years supporting the community with advice on issues such as hate crime, domestic violence, bullying, mental health, addiction and more. Will the Prime Minister join me in thanking Gianni G and their team for their work and wish them the very best of luck with their 350-mile charity bike ride from Edinburgh to West Bromwich next month?
I thank my honourable friend for raising the important work of Sikh Helpline UK, and I'm very happy to join her in wishing Johnny Singh and her team the very best of luck for their charity bike ride, Mr. Speaker.
Jonathan Edwards.
Mr. Speaker, Brexit is quickly turning into a story of betrayals. Firstly, it was the Northern Irish Unionists, then it was the fishermen, and now our farmers face a skewed trade deal with Australia. Yeah. The big question, therefore, is who comes next? Considering that the Trade Remedies Authority want to cut the protections on a half of steel products previously protected by the EU, are our steel industry and the vast supply chain they sustain next in line?
Yeah. No, Mr. Speaker, but can I just suggest to the honourable gentleman that once again he is completely missing, I think, the dynamism and optimism of so many people I meet in the agricultural sector who see opportunities for Welsh lamb and Welsh beef around the world. Why isn't he thinking of this as something as an opportunity for exports, Mr. Speaker, instead of cowering in this way? Welsh lamb, Welsh beef, Welsh farmers can do brilliantly from the deals we are opening up around the world, and he should be championing Welsh agriculture and Welsh produce.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. In East Surrey, I've been working with brilliant parish councils in Smallfield, Burstow and Horn to ensure we can get a better balance on HGV movements, allowing local businesses to thrive, but also ensuring that residents feel safe. I welcome the government's work to clamp down on moving traffic offences, but would the Prime Minister also consider taking another look at the powers of the Traffic Commissioner to ensure that we can find this balance?
Prime Minister.
Yes, Mr. Speaker, I thank my honourable friend for raising this point. Traffic enforcement outside London can only be undertaken by the police, but I will certainly look at the role of the Traffic Commissioner in the cases that she describes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Our greatest national asset, best of this country, record increase in funding, saved my life, no question, my #1 priority. All things the Prime Minister said about our NHS. Yet, award-winning South Tyneside Hospital has lost vital services and been told by his government to make further cuts to remaining services. Later today, I'm presenting a petition on behalf of over 40,000 of my constituents against these cuts. Like me, they want him to help us save our hospital and show for once that he is able to match his rhetoric with some action. Will he?
Yes, Mr. Speaker, and all the changes that she mentions will be consulted on in the usual way. I note that Dr. Shahid Wahi, the Executive Medical Director of the Trust, was recently quoted in the Shields Gazette as saying this is about improving surgical services. It is not about downgrading anything. And she mentions cuts, Mr. Speaker. This government, this year alone, has given another £92 billion to support our NHS, on top of the huge commitments we already made.
Final question, Jacob Young.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Yesterday we had the fantastic announcement of £25 million of investment into Redcar Town Centre, which will allow us to build a new water sports facility at Cortham, a new indoor activity centre on the Esplanade, and give the town a much-needed lift. I'm working with the Council on other bids for Eston and TS6 area, but in the meantime, can I invite the Prime Minister to come to the mighty Redcar and see our plans for levelling up our area, and I'll even treat him to a lemon top.
Thank you. Well, Mr. Speaker, I thank you, my honourable friend, who is a fantastic advocate for the people of Redcar, and thanks at least partly to his advocacy, we've announced a Towns deals to benefit Redcar. The Levelling Up Fund will help secure local investment in infrastructure and communities in Redcar, and as and when my diary permits, Mr. Speaker, I would be thrilled to come and join him for what I think he described as a lemon top.
On that basis, I'm now suspending the House for 3 minutes to enable necessary arrangements to be made for the next business order.